The body swung gently in the desert wind, casting a long shadow across the main street of Red Hollow. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Dalton brothers stood beneath the hanging tree with rifles cradled in their arms, daring anyone to cut the rope. Elena Ward collapsed in the dust, her scream tearing through the silence, a sound that would haunt the town for months to come. In that moment, Red Hollow learned a brutal lesson. Justice belonged to whoever held the most guns. But what the Daltons didn't know was that a stranger had just ridden into town, and he remembered when things were different. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything in Red Hollow. The morning Caleb Ward died, the sky burned red. Elena had watched her husband ride out before dawn, his shoulders square with determination, his jaw set in that stubborn way she'd come to love and fear in equal measure. He'd kissed her forehead, promised he'd be home by supper, and told her not to worry. The small ranch they'd built together sat just beyond the eastern edge of Red Hollow, 40 acres of scrubland that Caleb had somehow coaxed into producing decent grazing. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, or it had been, until the Daltons decided they wanted it. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier when Silas Dalton's men had ridden onto their property, announcing that the creek running through Caleb's land was needed for the Dalton cattle. No asking, no negotiating, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of casual arrogance that came from owning half the territory. Caleb had refused. Elena had begged him to reconsider, to just give them the water rights to avoid the fight. But her husband had worked too hard, sacrificed too much. "If we give them the creek," he'd said, his voice steady and sad, "they'll take the whole ranch next month. Then what? We keep running? Keep bowing? At some point, Elena, a man has to stand." So he'd stood. And the Daltons had made an example of him. By mid-morning, the entire town knew. Whispers spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. Caleb Ward had been found near the disputed creek, accused of cattle rustling, tried by Silas Dalton's sons, and sentenced on the spot. The rope had been thrown over the old cottonwood tree that marked the boundary between Dalton land and what used to be public grazing ground. Elena heard the news from Martha Chen, the seamstress who lived 2 doors down from the boarding house where Elena sometimes took in laundry. Martha's face had been pale, her hands shaking as she delivered the message. "I'm so sorry, Elena. They've taken him to town, Main Street. You should stay here." But Elena had run. She'd run through the dusty streets in her faded calico dress, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. People had turned away as she passed, unable to meet her eyes. Shop doors closed, windows shuttered. Red Hollow had learned long ago that watching a Dalton execution too closely could make you the next victim. When Elena reached the main street, a crowd had already gathered, silent, frozen, horrified. The Dalton brothers stood in a loose semicircle beneath the hanging tree. Marcus, the eldest, with his cold gray eyes and perfectly trimmed beard, James, the middle son, built like a bull and twice as mean, and young Thomas, barely 20 but already eager to prove himself worthy of the family name. And there, at the center of it all, was Caleb. They'd already put the noose around his neck. His hands were bound behind his back, his face bruised and bloodied. But even then, even in that moment, he stood tall. His eyes found Elena in the crowd, and something passed between them. Not goodbye, not surrender, just a quiet acknowledgement of what they'd both known might come. "This is what happens," Marcus Dalton announced, his voice carrying across the silent street, "when you steal from the Dalton family. This is what happens when you forget your place." "I didn't steal anything," Caleb's voice rang out, strong, despite the blood on his lips. "That creek runs through public land. It belongs to—" James Dalton struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Elena screamed and tried to push forward, but hands grabbed her arms. Neighbors, friends, people too terrified to help, but desperate to keep her from getting herself killed too. "Let me go! Caleb! Caleb!" Her husband's eyes found hers again. He tried to smile. Failed. Mouthed words she couldn't hear over her own sobbing. Marcus Dalton nodded to his brothers. James stepped forward and slapped the horse Caleb had been forced to stand on. The animal bolted. The rope snapped taut. Elena's scream tore the world apart. She didn't remember falling to her knees in the dust. Didn't remember the crowd dispersing like smoke, everyone suddenly having urgent business elsewhere. Didn't remember Martha Chen and old Samuel Wong trying to lift her, to guide her away, to spare her from watching as her husband's body swung in the hot wind. All she remembered was the sound of Marcus Dalton's boots on the wooden boardwalk as he walked away, and his parting words, "Somebody cut him down in an hour. We're not savages." The stranger rode into Red Hollow 3 days later, just as the sun began its descent toward the jagged western mountains. Victor Hale sat easy in the saddle, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the slanting light. He was a big man, built solid through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. His face was weathered and unreadable, deep lines around pale blue eyes that had seen too much, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. Dust covered his dark coat and worn boots. A Colt revolver rode on his hip, the leather holster scarred and faded from use. He'd been riding for weeks, maybe months, the kind of aimless drifting that men did when they were running from something or looking for something they couldn't name. The horse beneath him was a sturdy gray mare, patient and unflappable. They'd covered a lot of miles together. Red Hollow looked like 100 other frontier towns Victor had passed through. A single dirt main street lined with weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple. The hanging tree stood at the far end of town, its branches spreading wide like a dark warning. Victor noticed the tree immediately. Hard not to. The rope was still there, swaying gently. Nobody had bothered to take it down. He guided his horse toward the livery stable, dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too long in the saddle. A thin boy of maybe 14 emerged from the shadows, his eyes wary. "Need a stall for the night," Victor said, his voice rough from disuse. The boy nodded, took the reins, but didn't move. Just stood there, staring at Victor with an expression that was part curiosity, part fear. "Something wrong?" Victor asked. "You're new." "That a problem?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Just be careful. Town's not friendly to strangers right now." Victor studied the kid for a moment, recognized the haunted look in his eyes. This was a town that had learned to be afraid. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, flipping the boy a coin. "Take good care of her." The saloon was doing decent business for early evening. Victor pushed through the doors and was hit by the familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. Conversations died as he entered. Every eye in the place turned toward him, assessed him, cataloged him as potential threat or potential victim. Victor ignored them all and walked to the bar. The bartender was a heavy man with thinning hair and nervous hands. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey and information." "Whiskey I got. Information costs extra." Victor laid $1 on the scarred wood. "I'm looking for work. Ranch work, preferably. Know anybody hiring?" The bartender poured the drink, slid it across the bar, but didn't touch the money. "You don't want to work around here, friend. Trust me." "Why's that?" Before the bartender could answer, a voice came from across the room. "Because there's only one outfit worth working for in this territory, and they're particular about who they hire." Victor turned. A man in his 40s stood near a corner table, dressed in clean range clothes that marked him as someone with authority. His face was lean and calculating, his eyes sharp. "Name's Frank Hollister. I'm foreman for the Dalton ranch." "Victor Hale." Hollister walked closer, studying Victor with the practiced eye of a man who'd hired and fired hundreds of workers. "You look like you know your way around cattle and horses. Done any ranch work before?" "Some. Can you use that gun?" Victor's expression didn't change. "When I have to." Hollister smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The Dalton spread is the biggest operation within 200 miles. Good pay, decent food, and you follow orders without asking questions. You interested?" Every instinct Victor had cultivated over a lifetime of staying alive told him to refuse, to finish his drink and ride out before morning. This town had the feel of a place where bad things happened and nobody did anything to stop them. The hanging tree, the frightened boy at the livery, the way the bartender had tried to warn him off. But Victor was tired of drifting, tired of running from himself. And maybe a small part of him wondered, tired of turning away from trouble. "I'm interested," he said. Elena Ward had barely slept in 3 days. She sat in the small room she rented above the general store, staring at the single photograph she had of Caleb. It had been taken on their wedding day, 5 years ago. He'd been so young then, so full of hope. They both had been. The funeral had been small, a handful of people brave enough or kind enough to attend. The minister had spoken about mercy and forgiveness, about leaving justice to higher powers. Elena had stood there, hollow and empty, and wondered what justice looked like when the men who murdered your husband walked free. She'd tried to report the killing to Sheriff Porter, but the old man had refused to even write down her statement. "It was a legal proceeding, Mrs. Ward," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "Caleb was caught with Dalton cattle on Dalton land. The family has the right to protect their property. He was innocent. They lynched him. I can't help you." "You mean you won't?" The sheriff had just turned away, and Elena had understood with perfect clarity that she was alone. The law in Red Hollow belonged to the Daltons. The town belonged to the Daltons. Even the people who'd watched her husband die belonged to the Daltons, through fear, if not loyalty. But Elena had never been good at accepting things quietly. She'd spent the last 3 days asking questions, making a nuisance of herself, demanding that someone, anyone, acknowledge what had really happened. She'd confronted Marcus Dalton outside the land office, called him a murderer to his face in front of a dozen witnesses. He just smiled at her, tipped his hat, and suggested she be careful about making accusations she couldn't prove. Martha Chen had begged her to stop, to leave town, to go back east where she had family. "They'll kill you too, Elena, please. Caleb wouldn't want this." But Caleb was dead, and someone had to stand up. Now, as the evening shadows lengthened across her tiny room, Elena made a decision. If the law wouldn't help her, if the town was too frightened to act, then she would find someone who wasn't afraid of the Daltons. She'd heard the rumors, of course. Every frontier town had them, stories of gunslingers and hired guns, men who lived outside the law and made their living through violence. Elena had always thought such men were more myth than reality, products of overactive imaginations and too much cheap whiskey. But she was desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. She'd heard that a stranger had ridden into town that afternoon. A big man, quiet, with a gun on his hip, and the look of someone who knew how to use it. The boy from the livery stable, Danny Wong, Samuel's grandson, had mentioned it when he delivered her firewood. It probably meant nothing. Drifters passed through Red Hollow regularly, but Elena clung to the possibility like a drowning woman reaching for driftwood. She waited until full dark, then wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way downstairs. The general store was closed, its windows dark. She slipped out the back door and moved quickly through the alleys, avoiding the main street where the saloon spilled light and noise into the night. The stranger had taken a room at the boarding house on the eastern edge of town, Mrs. Patterson's place, which was respectable enough but didn't ask too many questions. Elena stood across the street, gathering her courage. What was she going to say? What could she offer this man? She had no money, no leverage, nothing but a widow's grief and a hunger for justice that consumed her like fever. Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena crossed the street and knocked on the front door. Mrs. Patterson answered, her round face creased with suspicion. "It's late, Elena." "I know. I'm sorry. I need to speak with your new guest, the man who arrived this afternoon." "Mr. Hale?" "Now?" "Elena, it's not proper." "Please." Elena's voice cracked. "Please, it's important." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Room 7, top of the stairs, but I'll be listening, and if I hear anything untoward, I'm getting the sheriff." Elena climbed the narrow staircase, her heart hammering. She found room 7 and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. The stranger stood there, filling the doorframe. He'd removed his coat and hat, revealing dark hair shot through with gray and those pale, watchful eyes. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Mr. Hale?" "That's right. My name is Elena Ward. I need your help." Victor studied the woman standing in the hallway. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair and darker eyes that held equal parts grief and determination. Her dress was worn but clean, carefully mended. Her hands were rough from work, and she looked at him with the kind of desperate hope that made his chest tight. "I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly. "You don't know what I think. You're looking for a hired gun, someone to kill the men who hurt you. It wasn't a question. Victor had seen that look before. In a dozen different towns, on a dozen different faces. Elena lifted her chin. They murdered my husband. Lynched him in the street like an animal. The law won't help. The town won't help. So yes, I'm looking for someone who will. And you think that's me? I think you're a man who knows how to fight. And I think maybe you're tired of running from it. Victor felt something shift in his chest. This woman was too smart, too observant. She'd seen something in him that he'd been trying to bury for years. I can't help you, he said, and started to close the door. Elena's hand shot out, stopping him. Please, I can't pay you. I have nothing. But I'm asking anyway because I don't know what else to do. They took everything from me. My husband, my home, my future. And they did it because they could, because nobody in this town has the courage to stand against them. Revenge won't bring your husband back. I'm not talking about revenge. Elena's voice was fierce now, burning with something Victor recognized as more dangerous than simple anger. I'm talking about justice. I'm talking about making them answer for what they did. I'm talking about showing this town that the Daltons aren't untouchable. Victor looked at this small, fierce woman and saw himself 20 years ago, young, angry, convinced that violence could fix what was broken in the world. He'd learned the hard way that it couldn't, that every man he'd killed had left a mark on his soul that no amount of distance or time could erase. I'm sorry about your husband, he said, and meant it. But I'm done with that life. I'm done with killing. Then what are you doing here? Why didn't you just ride past Red Hollow like every other drifter? Victor didn't have a good answer for that. Maybe he'd been tired. Maybe the town had seemed peaceful enough at first glance. Maybe some part of him had sensed the trouble brewing and been drawn to it like a moth to flame. I made a mistake, he said. I'll be leaving in the morning. Elena stared at him for a long moment, and Victor saw the hope drain from her eyes, replaced by something harder and colder. Fine, she said. Then I'll face them alone. That's suicide. Then I'll die. But at least I'll die knowing I didn't accept what they did. I didn't bow down. I didn't stay silent like everyone else in this coward's town. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. Victor stood in the doorway watching her go, fighting the urge to call her back. He knew what would happen if she confronted the Daltons alone. She'd end up swinging from the same tree as her husband, and the town would avert its eyes again, and nothing would change. But it wasn't his fight. He'd walked away from being a gunfighter years ago, made a promise to himself that he was done with violence. Getting involved now would just pull him back into the darkness he'd worked so hard to escape. He closed the door and stood in the small room, listening to the sounds of the town settling into night. Somewhere, a dog barked. Music drifted from the saloon. The wind rattled the window frame. Victor poured himself a drink from the bottle he'd bought earlier, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried not to think about the look in Elena Ward's eyes when she'd said she would face the Daltons alone. He tried not to think about another woman, a lifetime ago, who'd had that same fierce determination. He tried not to think about how that had ended. He failed on all counts. Morning came too early. Victor woke with the sun, his body following rhythms learned over decades of frontier life. He dressed quietly, strapped on his gun belt more out of habit than expectation of trouble, and went downstairs. Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen, making breakfast for her lodgers. She gave Victor a long, measuring look when he appeared. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Eggs and bacon if you want them." "Just coffee, thanks." She poured him a cup, then leaned against the counter, arms crossed. That poor girl who came by last night. Elena Ward. She was married to Caleb, the man the Daltons hanged. Victor didn't respond, just sipped his coffee. "He was a good man," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Worked hard, honest, the kind of person this territory needs if it's ever going to be civilized." She paused. "The Daltons have run this valley for 15 years. Before that, it was the Gannon gang. Before that, the Comanche. It's always been ruled by whoever had the most guns and the least conscience." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you look like a man who might be able to do something about it. And because I'm tired of watching good people die while everyone else pretends not to notice." Victor set down his cup. "I'm not a hero, Mrs. Patterson. I'm just a drifter looking for honest work." "Then you picked the wrong town. There's no honest work here, just the Daltons, and everyone who's too scared to stand against them." Before Victor could respond, the front door burst open. Danny Wong stumbled in, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mrs. Patterson, you gotta come quick. It's Mrs. Ward. She's on the main street, and she's confronting Marcus Dalton." Victor was moving before he'd consciously made the decision, his coffee forgotten, his earlier resolution to stay out of trouble evaporating like morning mist. He pushed past Danny and hit the street at a run, Mrs. Patterson's voice calling after him. The main street of Red Hollow was just coming to life. Shop owners were opening their doors, sweeping their stoops. Early risers headed toward the general store or the diner. And there, in the middle of the street, stood Elena Ward. She'd positioned herself directly in front of the Dalton Land and Cattle Company office, and she was shouting, "Murderers! You're all murderers! You lynched an innocent man, and you're going to get away with it because this whole town is too frightened to do anything." People froze. Doors that had just opened closed again. The few brave souls on the street quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. The door to the Dalton office swung open, and Marcus Dalton emerged, flanked by his brothers James and Thomas. All three were armed. Marcus looked more annoyed than angry, the expression of a man dealing with a persistent insect. "Mrs. Ward," Marcus said, his voice carrying false sympathy. "I understand you're grieving, but making wild accusations isn't going to bring your husband back. He wasn't a thief. He was defending land that belonged to everyone. The courts ruled otherwise." "What courts? You strung him up without a trial, without even letting him defend himself." James Dalton stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You need to move along, lady. Before you say something you'll regret."
"I regret nothing." Elena's voice was raw, breaking. "I regret that I live in a town full of cowards. I regret that my husband died believing people would do the right thing. I regret—" "Enough." Marcus's voice cut through her words like a blade. "You have until sunset to leave Red Hollow. If you're still here after that, you'll be arrested for disturbing the peace and threatening behavior."
"Threatening? I'm one woman. How am I threatening anyone?"
"You're inciting unrest."
"Spreading lies about a respected family. The sheriff has been very patient with you, Mrs. Ward, but even his patience has limits." Elena laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "The sheriff does whatever you tell him to do. Everyone in this town does whatever you tell them to do. Well, not me. I'm not leaving, and I'm not going to be quiet. Every person who walks down this street is going to hear what you did. Thomas Dalton moved so fast that Elena barely had time to react. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and grabbed her arm, yanking her toward him. "You heard my brother. Time to go." Elena tried to pull away, but Thomas was strong, his grip bruising. "Let go of me." "Not until you learn some manners." And that's when Victor stepped into the street. He'd been watching from the shadows of the boarding house, every instinct screaming at him to walk away, to let this play out, however it was going to play out. But when Thomas Dalton put his hands on Elena, something inside Victor snapped. "Let her go." The words came out quiet, but they carried. Everyone on the street turned to look at him, this tall, broad-shouldered stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. Thomas Dalton stared at him, confused. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing men put their hands on women." Marcus Dalton's eyes narrowed, reassessing Victor. "This isn't your concern, friend. We're dealing with a family matter." "Doesn't look like a family matter to me. Looks like 3 armed men threatening a widow." The street had gone completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. James Dalton took a step forward, his hand hovering near his gun. "You're new around here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. The Daltons run this valley. We keep the peace. We maintain order. And we don't need some drifter telling us our business." I'm just asking your brother to let the lady go," Victor said, his voice still calm, still reasonable. "After that, I'll walk away. And everyone can go about their day." "And if he doesn't?" Marcus asked. Victor's pale eyes found Marcus's, and something passed between them, a recognition, maybe, or a warning. "Then we'll have a problem." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Victor could see Marcus Dalton calculating odds, weighing options, trying to determine if this stranger was actually dangerous or just foolish. Finally, Marcus nodded to Thomas. "Let her go." Thomas released Elena's arm, shoving her away roughly. She stumbled but caught herself, her eyes going to Victor with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're making a mistake, friend, Marcus said to Victor. In this town, you're either with the Daltons or against them. There's no middle ground. Noted. Marcus stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the office, his brothers following. The door closed with a decisive click. Elena stood in the middle of the street, rubbing her arm where Thomas had grabbed her. Victor walked over to her. Are you hurt? I'm fine. She looked up at him, and there was something fierce and grateful in her expression. Thank you. That was stupid what you did, confronting them like that. I know. They could have killed you. I know. Victor shook his head. You need to leave town, Mrs. Ward, today, before sunset, like Marcus said. I'm not leaving. They'll arrest you, or worse. Let them try. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to something intense and private. You stood up for me. Why? Victor didn't have a good answer for that. Just seemed like the right thing to do. Most people in this town stopped doing the right thing a long time ago. She studied his face, searching for something. You're not just a drifter, are you? You're someone who knows how to fight. Someone who's tired of running. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. Elena reached out and touched his arm. A brief contact, but it sent electricity through Victor's chest. Help me, please. Not for revenge, for justice, for Caleb, for this town, for all the people who are too frightened to help themselves. Victor looked down at this small, fierce woman who refused to bend, who refused to accept the way things were, who was willing to stand alone against an empire built on fear and violence. He thought about walking away, leaving Red Hollow behind, finding some other town where the trouble wasn't his problem, but he'd been running for too long, and maybe, just maybe, this was where he finally stopped. I can't promise anything, he said quietly, but I'll think about it. Elena smiled, a small, sad expression that held more hope than Victor had seen in a long time. That's more than anyone else has given me. She turned and walked away, leaving Victor standing in the middle of the street as Red Hollow slowly came back to life around him. Frank Hollister appeared at his elbow, seeming to materialize out of nowhere. That was quite a show, Hale. Not sure if it was brave or stupid. Neither, just reflexive. Well, your reflexes just put you on the Daltons' bad side. That's not a healthy place to be. Victor looked at the foreman. We still have a deal? You offering me that job? Hollister studied him for a long moment, then smiled. A genuine expression this time. You know what? I think Silas Dalton would like you. He appreciates men with backbone. Come out to the ranch this afternoon. I'll introduce you. Why would he want to hire me after what just happened? Because Silas doesn't think like his sons. Marcus and the boys, they rule through fear and intimidation. But Silas, he's a businessman. He understands that sometimes you need a man who isn't afraid to step into trouble, someone who can handle problems that require a delicate touch. I'm not a killer for hire. Nobody said you were. Hollister clapped him on the shoulder. Just come talk to the old man. See what he has to say. Worst that happens, you get a free meal and a tour of the biggest cattle operation in the territory. Victor watched Hollister walk away, then looked back at the hanging tree at the end of the street. He'd come to Red Hollow looking for a fresh start, a place to forget who he'd been and what he'd done. Instead, he'd found himself right back in the middle of exactly what he'd been running from, a war between the powerful and the powerless, with innocent people caught in the crossfire. The smart thing would be to saddle up and ride out. But Victor had never been particularly smart when it came to walking away from trouble. He headed back to the boarding house to collect his gear, already knowing, with the kind of certainty that came from years of experience, that he'd just made a decision that was going to change everything. Behind him, hidden in the shadows of the general store, Elena Ward watched him go and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe she wasn't alone after all. The Dalton Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, its boundaries marked by miles of split-rail fencing and the kind of prosperity that came from taking what you wanted and keeping what you took. Victor rode beside Frank Hollister along the main road, watching the landscape transform from scrubland into carefully managed pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed beneath the afternoon sun. 15,000 head, Hollister said, following Victor's gaze. Give or take. Silas started with nothing 40 years ago. Just a wagon, a rifle, and enough ambition to choke a horse. Now he owns more land than some eastern states. How do you manage that? Hollister's smile was thin. Same way anyone builds an empire out here. He was tougher, meaner, and smarter than everyone else. The Comanche tried to run him off 3 times. Each time he came back with more men and bigger guns. Eventually they gave up and moved on. He paused. Of course, that was before the army cleared them out entirely. Victor said nothing, just kept his eyes on the approaching ranch house. It was massive by frontier standards, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property, bunkhouses, barns, a smithy, a cookhouse. Dozens of men moved through the compound, all wearing the same sun-faded work clothes and the wary expressions of people who knew their jobs depended on staying useful. Silas doesn't come to town much anymore, Hollister continued. Bad leg from an old injury, lets his boys handle most of the business. But he still runs the operation, still makes every important decision. They dismounted near the main house. A young Mexican hand took their horses without a word, leading them toward the stables. Hollister climbed the steps to the veranda and knocked on the door frame, though the door itself stood open to catch the breeze. "Mr. Dalton? It's Frank. Got that new man I mentioned." A voice came from inside, rough and commanding despite the years behind it. "Bring him in." The interior of the house was surprisingly refined. Polished wood floors, real glass windows, furniture that looked like it had been shipped from back east at considerable expense. Oil paintings hung on the walls, landscapes mostly, though Victor noticed one portrait of a severe-looking woman in her middle years. Silas Dalton sat in a leather chair near the fireplace, his bad leg propped on a footstool. He was in his 60s, Victor guessed, with iron gray hair and a face that might have been handsome before the frontier wore it down. His eyes were sharp and calculating, missing nothing as he examined Victor from head to toe. "So you're the one who stood up to Marcus this morning," Silas said without preamble. "Caused quite a stir in town." Victor met his gaze steadily. "Didn't mean to cause trouble, just didn't like seeing a woman get pushed around." "Chivalry?" Silas's mouth twitched. "That's rare out here. Most men learn pretty quick that chivalry gets you killed." He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Hale. Let's talk." Victor sat. Hollister remained standing near the door, watchful. "Frank tells me you're looking for ranch work," Silas continued. "Says you know cattle and horses. That true?" "I've worked spreads before. Texas, New Mexico territory. Know enough to earn my keep." "You any good with that gun you're wearing?" "When I need to be." Silas studied him for a long moment. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Hale, because I'm too old to waste time dancing around things. This valley is mine. I built it from nothing, and I intend to keep it. There are people, like that Ward woman, who don't understand how things work, who think they can challenge the natural order." He leaned forward slightly. "My sons sometimes handle these situations with more enthusiasm than finesse. I need men who can be firm without being stupid. Men who understand that power is about control, not just violence. You want me to intimidate people. I want you to help maintain order. There's a difference." "Is there?" Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You stood up for Elena Ward this morning. That tells me you have principles. But you're still here, talking to me, which tells me you're practical enough to understand that principles don't pay bills. So let me make you an offer. Work for me. $70 a month plus room and board. All I ask is that you follow orders and keep your mouth shut about ranch business." $70 was generous pay, far more than most outfits offered. Victor could feel Silas watching him, gauging his reaction, trying to determine what kind of man he was dealing with. "What happened to Caleb Ward?" Victor asked quietly. "The truth." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Hollister shifted uncomfortably near the door. Silas's expression hardened. "The truth is that Caleb Ward was caught with Dalton cattle on Dalton land. My sons dealt with it according to frontier justice. He was lynched without a trial. This isn't Boston, Mr. Hale. We don't have the luxury of waiting months for circuit judges and fancy lawyers. Out here, you protect what's yours, or you lose it." "And the creek? The water rights he was disputing?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "You ask a lot of questions for a man looking for work. Just trying to understand what I'm getting into." For a moment, Victor thought he'd pushed too far. Silas's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, and Hollister took a step forward. Then, unexpectedly, Silas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You've got stones, I'll give you that. Most men would be agreeing to anything I said by now." He settled back in his chair. "The creek runs through what used to be public grazing land. I filed a claim with the territorial office 3 years ago. It's legal and proper. Ward refused to accept it, so he had to be dealt with. Simple as that." It wasn't simple, and they both knew it. But Victor also understood that arguing the point would accomplish nothing except getting himself thrown off the property. "I'll take the job," he said, "but I'm not interested in hurting people who don't deserve it." "Fair enough. I don't pay men to hurt innocent people." Silas extended his hand. "Welcome to the Dalton Ranch, Mr. Hale. Frank will show you to the bunkhouse and explain your duties. We'll see how you work out." Victor shook the offered hand, feeling the surprising strength still in the old man's grip. As he turned to follow Hollister out, Silas's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Mr. Hale. Stay away from Elena Ward. She's trouble, and I don't need my men getting caught up in her crusade. You understand?" Victor looked back at the old man, saw the warning in his eyes, and nodded once. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright after the dim interior of the house. Hollister led him toward the bunkhouse, his expression unreadable. "You took a risk in there," Hollister said, "asking about Ward. Silas doesn't like being questioned." "Seemed like information I needed." "Maybe. But word of advice, don't go looking for trouble here. The Daltons have long memories and longer reach." He stopped near the bunkhouse door. "Your shift starts tomorrow at dawn. Tonight, get settled in, meet the other hands, keep your head down. And whatever you're thinking about that widow in town, forget it. Nothing good comes from mixing into Dalton business." Victor nodded, but said nothing. Hollister studied him for a moment longer, then walked away, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he'd just made a deal with the devil. The bunkhouse was long and low, with rows of narrow beds and footlockers. About 20 men lived here, Victor estimated, though only a handful were present at this hour. Most would be out working the range, tending to the endless tasks that kept a cattle operation running. The men who were present looked up as Victor entered, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. This was how it always worked. Every new hand had to prove himself, earn his place in the established hierarchy through work and temperament. "New blood," one man said, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down his left cheek. "Name's Garrett. You picked a bunk yet?" "Just got here." "Take the one in the corner far end. Previous owner won't be needing it anymore." Victor didn't ask what had happened to the previous owner. He just carried his saddlebags to the indicated bunk and started unpacking his meager possessions. A change of clothes, ammunition for his Colt, a worn copy of Homer's Odyssey that he'd been carrying for years, though he rarely opened it anymore. A small daguerreotype of a woman and a young girl, their faces serious in the formal style of old photographs. He caught Garrett watching the photograph and quickly tucked it away. "Got family?" Garrett asked. "Used to." That was all the explanation Victor offered, and to his credit, Garrett didn't press. In bunkhouses across the frontier, men understood that everyone had a past they'd rather not discuss. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and orientation. Victor met the other hands, learned the layout of the ranch, received his work assignment from Hollister. He'd be part of the crew managing the north pasture, which meant long days in the saddle, checking fences, moving cattle, and dealing with whatever problems arose. It was honest work, Victor told himself, hard labor that would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Maybe if he focused on the job, he could forget about Elena Ward and her dangerous crusade for justice. But when evening came and the hands gathered in the cookhouse for supper, the conversation inevitably turned to the morning's events in Red Hollow. "Heard you faced down Marcus Dalton," a young hand named Riley said, his eyes bright with excitement. "That true?" Victor focused on his plate. "It wasn't like that. Billy from the livery said you made Thomas let go of that widow woman. Said you stared down all 3 Dalton brothers without even touching your gun." "Billy talks too much." Garrett laughed. "Welcome to ranch life, Hale. Anything interesting that happens in Red Hollow becomes legend by sunset. Give it a week, and they'll be saying you shot Marcus between the eyes and rode off into the sunrise." The other men chuckled, but Victor noticed a few watching him with something more serious than amusement. These were men who'd worked for the Daltons long enough to understand the family's power and reach. They knew that standing up to Marcus, even in a small way, meant consequences. The Ward woman. another hand said quietly. This one was older, Mexican, with kind eyes. His name was Carlos, and he'd been working the Dalton ranch for nearly a decade. She has courage, that one. But courage without wisdom is just another word for suicide. You knew her husband? Victor asked. Carlos nodded. Caleb Ward was a good man, worked hard, treated everyone with respect, even people like us that others looked down on. He paused. What happened to him was wrong, but wrong things happen all the time out here. The only difference is whether you're strong enough to do something about it or smart enough to know when you can't. The implication hung in the air. Victor was strong enough, maybe, but probably not smart enough to know when to walk away. After supper, Victor stepped outside to smoke and think. The ranch was settling into night, the sky deepening from blue to purple to black. Stars emerged one by one, more than you could ever see back east, where the cities blotted them out with their own artificial light. He was reaching for his tobacco when he heard horses approaching. 4 riders emerged from the darkness, and even before he could make out their faces, Victor recognized the bearing of men who expected deference. The Dalton brothers had come home. Marcus led the group, sitting tall in his saddle with that aristocratic bearing he probably thought made him look important. James and Thomas flanked him, and a 4th man Victor didn't recognize brought up the rear. They rode past the cookhouse toward the main house, not even glancing at the ranch hands. But Thomas Dalton saw Victor standing in the shadows, and their eyes met for a brief moment. The younger Dalton's expression twisted with something between recognition and contempt before he turned away and continued on. That's trouble, Garrett said, appearing at Victor's elbow with his own cigarette. Thomas has been itching to prove himself since his 16th birthday. You embarrassed him this morning in front of the whole town. He won't forget that. Wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. Doesn't matter what you were trying to do. Only matters how he took it. Garrett exhaled smoke into the night air. Watch your back, Hale. The Daltons don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't forget. Victor finished his cigarette in silence, then returned to the bunkhouse. Most of the other hands had turned in early, exhausted from a long day's work. He lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, and wondered what Elena Ward was doing right now. Probably still in Red Hollow, still refusing to back down, still putting herself in danger because she believed justice mattered more than survival. Victor had known women like her before. Strong women, principled women, women who stood up for what was right even when it cost them everything. He'd been married to one, once. Sarah had been a school teacher in a small Kansas town, educated and idealistic, convinced that civilization could be brought to the frontier through books and proper grammar. She'd married Victor when he was still young and stupid enough to believe he could leave his violent past behind, that love and hard work could transform him into someone better. They'd had a daughter, Emily, beautiful and bright, with her mother's dark hair and her father's pale eyes. For 5 years, Victor had been happy in a way he'd never imagined possible. He'd worked as a ranch foreman, saved money, built a small house, and dreamed about the future. Then the Gannon gang had ridden through town. They'd been looking for Victor, hunting him because of something he'd done years before, during his time as a hired gun. A man Victor had killed, a man who probably deserved killing, but whose brother disagreed, had finally tracked him down. Victor hadn't been home when they came. He'd been out checking a fence line 3 miles from town. By the time he'd heard the shots and raced back, it was over. Sarah and Emily, dead in the front yard of the house he'd built, killed because someone wanted to hurt Victor in the worst way possible. He'd hunted down every member of that gang, killed them one by one, methodically and without mercy. It had taken him 2 years, and when it was finished, he'd looked at himself in a mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. That was when he'd started drifting, running from himself, trying to find some place where the past couldn't reach him and the future didn't demand anything. But here, in this bunkhouse on the Dalton ranch, Victor finally admitted what he'd known since the moment he'd stepped into that street to confront Thomas Dalton. He was tired of running. Elena Ward reminded him of Sarah, not in appearance, but in that fierce determination to stand for something even when it would be easier, safer to bend. And watching her face down the Dalton brothers alone had cracked something open in Victor's chest, something he'd kept locked away for years. Maybe he couldn't save Sarah and Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could help Elena Ward survive long enough to get the justice she was fighting for, even if it meant going to war with the most powerful family in the territory. The next morning came cold and gray, with frost on the ground and the promise of winter in the air. Victor rode out with Garrett and 2 other hands to check the north fence line, a task that would take most of the day. The work was hard and monotonous, exactly what Victor needed. He focused on the physical labor, letting his body move through familiar motions while his mind worked through the problem of the Daltons. Silas was the key, Victor realized. The old man was smart, calculating, and ultimately practical. He'd built his empire through ruthlessness, yes, but also through understanding when to push and when to hold back. His sons, especially Marcus and Thomas, were different, younger, more arrogant, convinced that their father's power made them invincible. That arrogance was a weakness, and weaknesses could be exploited. "You're quiet," Garrett observed as they stretched new wire across a broken section of fence. "Thinking about that widow?" Victor didn't answer, just hammered another staple into place. "Word is she's still in town," Garrett continued. "Didn't leave by sunset like Marcus ordered. Sheriff Porter went to arrest her this morning, but she barricaded herself in her room at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson standing with her, refusing to let anyone in." Victor's hand stilled on the wire. "When did this happen?" "Early this morning. Whole town's talking about it." "Porter going to force his way in?" Garrett shook his head. "Sheriff's a coward, but he's not stupid. He knows if he hurts a woman, especially with Mrs. Patterson as a witness, it'll turn the whole town against the Daltons. So now it's a standoff. Elena's trapped in the boarding house, and the Daltons are trying to figure out how to handle it without making themselves look like the villains they are." Victor stood up, his mind racing. Elena was making her stand just like she'd said she would. But she was cornered now, with no way out and no allies except an old woman who ran a boarding house. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked, watching him carefully. "I'm thinking I need to go into town." "That's a bad idea, Hale. You work for the Daltons now. Getting involved in this will get you fired at best, killed at worst." "Maybe." Victor started walking toward his horse. "But I can't just stand here knowing she's trapped." Garrett grabbed his arm. "Listen to me. I've been working this ranch for 8 years. I've seen what happens to people who cross the Daltons. It doesn't end well. You want to help that woman? Best thing you can do is keep your head down, save your money, and maybe in a few months when this blows over, you can offer her some cash to start over somewhere else. She won't leave. Then she'll die. And if you throw yourself into the fire with her, you'll die too." "For what? Justice?" Garrett's laugh was bitter. "Justice is a luxury, Hale. Out here, survival is the only thing that matters." Victor looked at the older man and saw the resignation in his eyes, the weariness of someone who'd compromised so many times that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand for something. "I appreciate the advice," Victor said quietly, "but I have to go." He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch house, leaving Garrett standing by the fence line, shaking his head. Frank Hollister was in the yard when Victor arrived, supervising the shoeing of several horses. He looked up as Victor dismounted, his expression immediately wary. "You're supposed to be on the north fence." "I need to go into town." "What for?" Victor met his eyes. "Personal business." Hollister studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Elena Ward. I just want to make sure she's all right. She's fine. Locked in her room like a stubborn child, but fine. Sheriff's keeping an eye on the situation." "Then there's no harm in me checking on her." "There's every harm in it, Hale. Silas gave you a direct order yesterday. Stay away from the Ward woman. You go riding into town now, you're defying him. You understand what that means?" Victor understood perfectly. It meant losing his job, probably getting run out of the valley, possibly getting killed if the Daltons decided to make an example of him. But it also meant looking at himself in the mirror and recognizing the man staring back. "I understand," Victor said. "But I'm going anyway." Hollister's jaw tightened. For a moment, Victor thought the foreman might try to stop him physically. Then Hollister stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Your funeral?" he said. "But don't come crying to me when it all goes sideways." Victor rode toward Red Hollow, with the morning sun climbing higher, burning off the frost. The town looked peaceful from a distance, just another frontier settlement going about its business. But as he got closer, Victor could see the tension in the air. People moving quickly, keeping to themselves, avoiding the main street where Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood with its doors shut and curtains drawn. Sheriff Porter stood on the porch, looking tired and irritated. He straightened when he saw Victor approaching, his hand dropping instinctively toward his sidearm. "You're that new Dalton hand," Porter said, "the one who caused trouble yesterday." "I'm here to check on Mrs. Ward." "She's fine. Now move along before you make this situation worse." "I'd like to hear that from her." Porter's face reddened. "I don't care what you'd like. This is official business. The woman's being detained for disturbing the peace and refusing a lawful order to leave town." "Detained? She's locked in her own room. She's refusing to come out and face justice." "Justice." Victor let the word hang between them. "That what you call it when the Daltons say jump and you ask how high?" The sheriff's hand moved closer to his gun. "You're about 2 seconds away from joining her under arrest, friend." "Then arrest me." They stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Victor knew he was pushing too hard, too fast, but he also knew that sometimes the only way to break a deadlock was to force a confrontation. Before either man could make a move, the front door of the boarding house opened. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her round face set with determination. "Sheriff Porter, I've told you 3 times already. Elena Ward is my guest, and she's done nothing wrong. You want to arrest her, you'll have to come through me." "Mrs. Patterson, please don't make this harder than it has to be. The only people making this hard are you and the Daltons." She turned her gaze to Victor. "Mr. Hale, come inside. Elena would like to speak with you." Porter moved to block the door. "Nobody goes in or out until this is resolved." "Then I suppose we'll all be standing here for quite some time," Mrs. Patterson said calmly. "Because I'm not budging, and neither is Elena." Victor made a decision. He brushed past the sheriff, ignoring the older man's sputtered protests, and followed Mrs. Patterson inside. Elena's room was on the 2nd floor, small and spare, but clean. She stood by the window, looking out at the street below, and turned when Victor entered. Her face was pale, exhausted, but her eyes still held that fierce determination. "You came," she said softly. "You're trapped. I'm making a statement. You're going to get yourself killed." Elena smiled, sad and knowing. "Probably, but at least I'll die standing up instead of on my knees." She moved away from the window, gesturing for him to sit. "I heard you took a job with the Daltons, working on their ranch. Seemed like the smart play. And yet here you are." Victor sat on the edge of the narrow bed, suddenly feeling the weight of all his choices pressing down on him. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he admitted. "I should be out fixing fences, keeping my head down, collecting my pay. Instead, I'm in the middle of something that's going to end badly for everyone involved." "You could still walk away," Elena said. "Nobody would blame you." "Yes, they would. I'd blame me." She sat beside him, and Victor caught the scent of lavender soap mixed with fear sweat and determination. "Tell me about yourself, Victor Hale. Who were you before you drifted into Red Hollow?" "Nobody important." "I don't believe that." So Victor told her. Not everything. He couldn't bring himself to speak about Sarah and Emily, not yet, but enough. About working as a hired gun when he was younger. About the violence he'd done and the men he'd killed. About trying to leave that life behind and discovering it followed him anyway. Elena listened without judgment, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "We're the same, you and me," she finally said. "Both trying to outrun our pasts. Both failing." She looked at him directly. "But maybe that's not what we should be doing. Maybe instead of running, we should stand and fight. Against the Daltons? That's suicide. So is running. They own this whole valley, Victor. Where could we run that they wouldn't eventually find us? Where could we go that men like them don't exist?" She stood up, pacing the small room. "Caleb used to say that evil thrives when good people do nothing. I never really understood what he meant until I watched him die while the whole town looked away." "What's your plan?" Victor asked. "You can't stay locked in this room forever." "I know, but every day I hold out, every day I refuse to bend, I prove that the Daltons aren't as powerful as they want people to believe. I prove that someone can stand against them and survive." "You're not surviving, you're trapped. For now." Elena's smile was sharp. "But situations change. People change. Maybe if I hold out long enough, someone else in this town will find the courage to stand with me." Victor looked at this woman, This fierce, stubborn, probably doomed woman, and felt something shift in his chest. The same feeling he'd had yesterday when he'd stepped into the street to confront Thomas Dalton. "I'll help you," he heard himself say. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure something out." "You'll lose your job." "Had worse losses." Elena reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you for everything. For standing up for me yesterday. For coming here today. For not looking away like everyone else." Before Victor could respond, footsteps thundered on the stairs. The door burst open and Thomas Dalton stormed in, his face flushed with anger, his hand on his gun. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Thomas snarled. "The widow and the traitor plotting together." Victor stood slowly, putting himself between Thomas and Elena. "Easy now. Nobody needs to get hurt." "You're right about that. Soon as you step aside and let me do what needs doing." Thomas's eyes were wild, dangerous. This wasn't the calculated cruelty of his older brother Marcus. This was raw emotion barely contained. "You made me look weak yesterday, Hale. Made me look like a coward in front of the whole town. That wasn't my intention." "I don't care about your intentions." Thomas's voice rose. "I care that people saw me back down. Me, a Dalton." The door filled with more people. Sheriff Porter, looking panicked, Mrs. Patterson, her face pale, and finally Marcus Dalton himself, calm and composed as always. "Thomas," Marcus said quietly, "lower your weapon, now." "But he—" "Now." Thomas reluctantly complied, though his hand stayed near his gun. Marcus stepped into the small room, his eyes moving from Victor to Elena and back again. "Mr. Hale, you're proving to be more trouble than you're worth. My father hired you to work cattle, not to romance widows and cause problems. I'm not causing problems. I'm trying to prevent them. By defying direct orders? By interfering in family business?" Marcus's voice remained calm, but Victor heard steel underneath. "You have two choices. Walk away now, return to the ranch, and we'll forget this happened. Or stay here with Mrs. Ward and accept the consequences." "What consequences?" Marcus smiled. "The same ones her husband faced." The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. Victor felt Elena's hand on his arm, felt her fear and determination in equal measure. This was the moment. The choice that would define everything that came after. Victor looked at Marcus Dalton and made his decision. "I'm staying." Marcus Dalton's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. He studied Victor for a long moment, the kind of assessment a predator makes before deciding whether prey is worth the effort. "Then you're a fool," Marcus said quietly. He turned to Sheriff Porter. "Arrest them both. Charge them with conspiracy to disturb the peace and resisting lawful authority." Porter shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, I'm not sure we have grounds to— Are you the law in this town, or aren't you?" The sheriff's face reddened, but he nodded and reached for the iron shackles on his belt. Victor's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, and the room exploded into motion. Thomas drew his weapon. Mrs. Patterson screamed, and Elena grabbed Victor's arm. "Don't!" she whispered urgently. "Not like this." Victor's hand froze. She was right. Drawing on them now would be suicide, and it would give the Daltons exactly what they wanted, an excuse to kill him and call it self-defense. He raised his hand slowly, letting Porter see he wasn't going for his weapon. The sheriff moved forward, his own hand shaking as he reached for Victor's gun belt. "I'm sorry," Porter muttered. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to protect people," Victor said, "not to be the Daltons' lapdog." The shackles closed around Victor's wrists with a cold metallic click. Porter moved to Elena next, his face miserable as he bound her hands. "This is illegal," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't just arrest people for nothing." "They can and they will," Marcus said. He gestured toward the door. "Take them to the jail, keep them separated, and make sure they understand that continued resistance will only make things worse." Thomas grabbed Victor's arm, shoving him toward the door with more force than necessary. Victor let himself be pushed, keeping his expression neutral even as his mind raced through possibilities. The jail in Red Hollow was a small stone building behind the sheriff's office. 2 cells with iron bars and a single guard, usually old Deputy Harmon, who spent most of his time asleep. They were marched down the stairs and into the street. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Victor saw faces he recognized from the saloon, from the general store, from his brief time in town. Every single one of them looked away as he passed, unwilling to meet his eyes, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. All except one. Danny Wong, the boy from the livery stable, stood near the edge of the crowd, his young face twisted with anger and frustration. His grandfather Samuel held his arm, keeping him from doing something stupid, but the old man's eyes met Victor's for just a moment. There was something there. Sympathy maybe, or recognition, or perhaps just the shared understanding of what it meant to be powerless in a town owned by men like the Daltons. The jail was exactly as Victor remembered from his first day in Red Hollow. Small, dark, smelling of old sweat and desperation. Porter unlocked one of the cells and shoved Victor inside, then took Elena to the cell next door. The iron door clanged shut with terrible finality. "I'll bring water and food later," Porter said, not looking at either of them. "Just try to stay calm. Maybe if you cooperate, this can all be worked out peacefully." "Cooperate?" Elena's voice cut through the dim space like a blade. "You mean if we agree to let the Daltons do whatever they want? If we pretend Caleb's murder never happened?" Porter flinched but didn't respond. He just locked the outer door and left them alone in the shadows. Victor gripped the iron bars, testing their strength. Solid, old but well-maintained. The lock was simple but effective, and without tools, he had no chance of picking it. The single window was small and barred, high enough that even if he could reach it, he couldn't fit through. "Victor?" Elena's voice came from the next cell, tight with fear she was trying hard to hide. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet. They're going to kill us, aren't they? Just like they killed Caleb." "Maybe, but we're not dead yet." Victor sat on the hard wooden bench that served as a bed, his mind working through the problem. "Marcus is smart. He won't make the same mistake twice. Lynching you in the street would turn public opinion against the Daltons, especially after you've been locked up. He'll want it to look legal. A trial, maybe. Or at least the appearance of one. And then? Then we'll be found guilty and hanged. But it takes time to set that up, time we can use." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I got you into this." "You didn't get me into anything. I made my own choice. A choice that's going to get you killed." Victor thought about Sarah and Emily, about all the choices he'd made that had led him to this jail cell in this forgotten town. "I've been running from making real choices for a long time," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stood for something, even if it costs me." Before Elena could respond, the outer door opened again. Victor tensed, expecting Porter or one of the Dalton brothers. Instead, Frank Hollister walked in, his weathered face grim. "Hale!" Hollister said, standing outside Victor's cell. "You're an idiot." "So I've been told. Silas sent me. He's willing to make you an offer. You leave town tonight, ride out, keep riding, and never come back. Do that, and you walk away alive." "And Elena?" Hollister's expression hardened. "She stays. Faces whatever consequences Marcus decides on. That's non-negotiable." Victor stood up, walked to the bars, looked Hollister in the eye. "Then the answer's no. You'd throw your life away for a woman you barely know." "I'm throwing my life away for the principle that you can't just murder people and expect everyone to look the other way." Hollister shook his head slowly. "Principles. Always comes down to principles with men like you. You know what principles get you out here? A shallow grave and nobody to remember your name." He paused. "But I'll tell you something. I've worked for the Daltons for 12 years. Watched them build this empire through blood and fear. And every single day, I've told myself it was necessary. That this is just how things work in the territories. That strong men have to make hard choices. You don't believe that anymore?" "I don't know what I believe." Hollister's voice was raw, honest in a way Victor hadn't expected. "But I know that hanging Caleb Ward was wrong. And I know that whatever Marcus is planning for you and Elena is wrong too. Problem is, knowing something's wrong and having the courage to do something about it are two different things." Victor understood. Hollister was a man caught between what he knew was right and what was safe, between his conscience and his survival. It was a position Victor recognized all too well. "You could help us," Victor said quietly. "Leave the door unlocked. Look the other way. Give us a chance. And then what? You ride off into the sunset and the Daltons never track you down? They own this whole valley, Hale. Hell, they own half the territory. There's nowhere you could run that they wouldn't eventually find you. Then maybe running isn't the answer. Maybe it's time someone stood up to them. Hollister laughed, but it was a bitter sound. You think you can take down the Dalton Empire? You and a widow with no money and no allies? That's not courage, friend. That's suicide.
What if we had allies? Who? The townspeople are terrified. The ranch hands are loyal because it pays better than starving. The law belongs to Silas. Who's left? Victor thought about Danny Wong's angry face, about Samuel's sympathetic eyes, about Mrs. Patterson standing in her doorway defying the sheriff. People who are tired of being afraid. People who are waiting for someone else to make the first move. You're dreaming. Maybe. But dreams are all I've got right now. Hollister stared at him for a long moment, then turned to leave. At the door he paused.
For what it's worth, Hale, I hope you're right. I hope there are enough good people left in this valley to make a difference. But I've seen what happens to people who go against the Daltons, and hoping doesn't change reality. After he left, Victor sat in the darkness, listening to Elena's quiet breathing from the next cell. Night fell slowly, shadows deepening until he could barely see his own hands.
Victor? Elena's voice came soft through the darkness. Tell me about them, your family, the ones in the photograph.
He didn't want to talk about it. Hadn't spoken Sarah's name aloud in years, but something about the darkness and the danger and this woman's courage made the words come easier. Her name was Sarah, he said. We met in Kansas, got married young, had a daughter, Emily. She was 5 when they died. Elena was silent, letting him continue at his own pace.
I thought I could leave my past behind, Victor continued, his voice rough with old grief. Thought I could be a different man, a better man. But the violence followed me anyway. Men I'd wronged came looking for revenge, and when they couldn't find me, they hurt the people I loved instead. I'm sorry. I hunted them down, killed every last one. Took me 2 years. And when it was done, I looked at myself and realized I'd become exactly what I was trying to escape. So I started drifting. Figured if I never stayed in one place, never let myself care about anyone, I could keep the violence from touching innocent people. But you stayed here. Yeah. Why? Victor was quiet for a long time. Because I'm tired of running. Tired of pretending I can escape what I am. And because when I saw you standing alone against the Daltons, refusing to bend, it reminded me of Sarah. She had that same fire. That same stubborn courage. He paused. She would have done exactly what you're doing, standing up, fighting back, refusing to accept injustice. What happened to her wasn't your fault, Victor. Wasn't it? If I'd been a different man, made different choices, they'd still be alive. And if Caleb had just given the Daltons the water rights, he'd still be alive, but he wouldn't have been the man I loved. Sometimes the right choice is the dangerous one, and we can't let fear of consequences stop us from doing what's right. Victor gripped the cold iron bars, Elena's words settling into his chest like hot coals. She was right. He'd spent years blaming himself for Sarah's death, but the truth was more complicated. The men who killed her had made their own choices, and Victor had made his. You couldn't change the past, but you could choose how you face the future. Footsteps on the porch outside interrupted his thoughts. The door opened and Deputy Harmon shuffled in, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and water. Supper, the old man muttered, sliding the food through the slot in Victor's cell door. He moved to Elena's cell and did the same, his movements mechanical, his eyes carefully avoiding theirs. Deputy, Victor said, how long have you lived in Red Hollow? Harmon paused. Near about 30 years. Why? Then you remember what it was like before the Daltons. The old man's face tightened. Don't see what good remembering does. You remember when this was a town instead of a prison? When people could speak their minds without wondering if it would get them killed? That was a long time ago, son. Things change. You either change with them or get left behind. Or you stand up and fight to make things better. Harmon looked at him with tired, defeated eyes. I'm too old to fight. Too old to believe it would make a difference, even if I tried. He turned to leave, then stopped. But for what it's worth, I hope you're not as foolish as you seem. This valley needs men with backbone.
Always has. After the deputy left, Victor ate slowly, thinking. The bread was stale but edible, the cheese decent. He saved some water, knowing it might be hours before they were given more. Elena picked at her food without much interest. What if Hollister's right? She asked. Shikit. What if we're just fooling ourselves? Two people against an empire? Every empire starts with one person saying no, Victor said. And every empire falls when enough people finally believe that no can make a difference. That's not very comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true. They sat in silence as full darkness settled over Red Hollow. Victor dozed fitfully, years of frontier living making him sleep light even in the worst circumstances. Dreams came. Sarah's face, Emily's laughter, the sound of gunshots and screaming. He woke several times, disoriented, before remembering where he was. Sometime deep in the night, a sound brought him fully awake. Footsteps on the porch, but lighter than Harmon's shuffling gait. The door opened slowly, and a small figure slipped inside. Danny Wong moved through the darkness with the confidence of youth, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. He crept to Victor's cell, his young face set with determination. "Mr. Hale," he whispered, "I brought tools from my grandfather's workshop." Victor sat up quickly. "Danny, what are you doing? If you're caught—" "I know, but I can't just do nothing. Caleb Ward was kind to me, treated me like a person, not just a Chinese boy people look down on. And you stood up for Mrs. Ward when nobody else would." He pushed the bundle through the bars. "Grandfather says the Daltons have ruled long enough. Says sometimes the young have to do what the old are too afraid to do." Victor unwrapped the cloth and found a small file, a thin pry bar, and a heavy hammer. Not much, but potentially enough. "Your grandfather knows you're here. He's watching the street. Deputy Harmon's at the saloon. Won't be back for an hour at least. But you have to be quick. Danny, listen to me carefully. When this is over, however it ends, you and your grandfather need to deny you were ever here. Understand? I stole these tools somehow. You had nothing to do with it." The boy nodded, but Victor could see the fear beneath his bravado. This was a kid trying to be brave in a world that punished bravery. "Thank you," Victor said quietly. "You've got more courage than most grown men in this town." Danny smiled briefly, then slipped back out into the night as silently as he'd come. Victor immediately went to work on the lock. It was old but solid, designed to keep drunks and petty thieves contained, not to withstand determined effort. He used the file to work at the mechanism, patient and methodical despite the urgency pounding through his veins. "What's happening?" Elena whispered from her cell. "We're leaving, soon as I get this lock open." "Then what? We run?" "No, we fight." The lock finally gave with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet jail. Victor eased the door open, grabbed the tools, and moved to Elena's cell. This lock was identical to his own, and now that he understood the mechanism, it took him less than 5 minutes. Elena stepped out, rubbing her wrists where the shackles had left marks. "Where do we go?" "First, we need weapons. My gun's probably in the sheriff's office. Then we need to get somewhere defensible and figure out our next move." They crept to the door, listening. The street outside was dark and empty, Red Hollow sleeping except for the distant sounds from the saloon. Victor eased the door open and they slipped out into the cool night air. The sheriff's office was attached to the jail, its door locked but flimsy. Victor used the pry bar, the wood splintering with cracks that seemed impossibly loud. Inside, he found his gun belt hanging on a peg, his Colt still in its holster. He strapped it on, feeling immediately more balanced, more ready. "Now what?" Elena asked. Before Victor could answer, shouts erupted from down the street. Someone had spotted the broken door, or maybe Danny had been caught. Either way, their window of opportunity was closing fast. "Run," Victor said, grabbing Elena's hand. They ran through the back alleys of Red Hollow, staying in shadows, moving toward the edge of town. Behind them, more shouts rose up. Lanterns appeared in windows. The alarm was spreading. Victor's mind raced. They needed horses, supplies, and most importantly, they needed a plan beyond simple flight. The Daltons would hunt them relentlessly, and running would only delay the inevitable. They reached the livery stable breathless and wild-eyed. Samuel Wong was already there, 2 horses saddled and ready, supplies tied to the saddle horns. "My grandson said you might need these," Samuel said calmly, as if providing getaway horses in the middle of the night was perfectly ordinary. "The gray mare is yours from before. The bay is steady and strong. Should carry Mrs. Ward well enough." "Samuel, you could hang for this," Victor said. The old man smiled slightly. "I'm 73 years old, Mr. Hale. I've spent most of my life bowing my head and accepting the way things are. If I hang for finally doing something right, so be it." Elena embraced the old man impulsively. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet. You've got a long, hard road ahead." He handed Victor a rifle. "This belonged to my son. He won't be needing it anymore." Victor took the weapon, recognizing the weight of what Samuel was giving him, not just a gun, but trust and hope, and the burden of using them wisely. They mounted quickly. Victor could hear riders approaching, see torches moving through the streets. The Daltons had mobilized fast. "Head north," Samuel said. "There's an old ghost town about 20 miles from here, place called Redemption. Been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still standing. You could hole up there, make them come to you on your terms." It was solid advice. Running blindly would just get them caught. But if they could reach defensible ground, they might have a chance. "One more thing," Samuel said, pulling a leather satchel from his coat. "I've been collecting these for years. Statements from people the Daltons have wronged, letters, testimonies, evidence of land fraud and murder and every other crime you can imagine. Nobody would stand up before because they knew it would mean death, but maybe now, with you two making a stand, things can change." Victor took the satchel, feeling the weight of it. This was more than just paper and ink. This was the accumulated pain and anger of an entire community that had been silenced for too long. "If we survive this," Victor said, "this evidence could destroy the Daltons." "If you survive," Samuel agreed. "Now go, and may fortune ride with you." They rode north into the darkness, Red Hollow falling away behind them. Victor could hear pursuit forming, horses being saddled, men shouting, the Dalton brothers organizing their hunt. But they had a head start, and the night was dark, and sometimes that was all you needed. Elena rode beside him, her face pale in the starlight but determined. "Redemption," she said. "Fitting name for a ghost town. Let's hope it's a prophecy." They pushed the horses hard for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and Red Hollow. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills, the trail becoming more treacherous. Victor navigated by starlight and instinct, trusting his years of frontier experience to keep them moving in the right direction. When they finally slowed to rest the horses, Elena spoke for the first time since leaving town. "What's your real plan, Victor? We can't hide forever." "We're not hiding, we're positioning. Samuel's evidence could bring down the Daltons if we can get it to the right people. Territorial authorities, maybe a federal marshal, but we need time, and we need leverage." "What kind of leverage?" Victor was silent for a moment, an idea forming in his mind. Dangerous, reckless, exactly the kind of thing that could either save them or get them killed. "The Daltons have one weakness," he said slowly. "One thing they value more than power or money." "What's that?" "Family, specifically Clara Dalton, Silas's only daughter." Elena stared at him. "You want to kidnap her?" "Not kidnap, borrow. Just long enough to force Silas to the negotiating table. If we have Clara, the Daltons can't just hunt us down and kill us. They'll have to talk. And while they're talking, we can get this evidence to people who can actually do something with it." That's insane." "You have a better idea?" Elena thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "No. But if we do this, if we take that girl, there's no going back. The Daltons will never stop hunting us." "They were never going to stop anyway," Victor said. "At least this way we control the game instead of just running from it." They rode on through the night, the plan taking shape in Victor's mind. It was dangerous, maybe suicidal, but it was also the kind of bold move that might actually work. The Daltons expected them to run scared, to hide like wounded animals. Striking back, taking the fight to them, was the last thing they'd anticipate. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when they finally saw Redemption, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled in a narrow canyon, abandoned to wind and time. The town had been built during a brief silver boom 15 years earlier, thrived for a few years, then died when the veins played out. Now it was just empty shells and broken dreams, a monument to the frontier's harsh promise. They rode down the main street, their horses' hooves echoing off the weathered buildings. Most of the structures were beyond saving, but a few looked solid enough to serve their purpose. The old hotel still had a roof, and the church at the far end of town stood like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. Victor chose a 2-story building that had once been a saloon and gambling hall. It had good sight lines, multiple exits, and walls thick enough to stop bullets. They secured the horses in what remained of the stable, then went inside to assess their situation. The interior was dusty and filled with the detritus of abandonment, broken furniture, shattered bottles, faded playing cards scattered across the floor. But the structure was sound, and from the second-floor windows they could see anyone approaching from miles away. Elena sank onto a rickety chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Now what? Now we rest. Figure out exactly how we're going to get to Clara Dalton without getting ourselves killed in the process. Victor opened Samuel's satchel and spread the contents across a table. Letters, documents, sworn statements, years of evidence carefully collected and preserved. He read through them slowly, his anger building with each new revelation. Land seized through fraudulent claims, water rights stolen, people beaten, intimidated, killed. The Daltons' empire wasn't built on hard work and determination. It was built on systematic theft and violence, enabled by corrupt officials and enforced through fear. This is enough, Victor said quietly. More than enough to bring them down, if we can get it to the right people. That's a big if. Yeah, but it's all we've got. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desolate ghost town. Caleb would have loved this, fighting back, making a stand. He always said that sometimes you have to risk everything for what's right. He was a good man. He was stubborn and idealistic and completely impractical. Elena's voice caught, and I loved him for it. Still do. Victor joined her at the window. In the growing light, he could see the beauty of this forgotten place. The way the morning sun painted the canyon walls gold, the stark elegance of abandonment, the promise of a new day despite all the darkness. We're going to finish what he started, Victor said. We're going to make the Daltons answer for what they've done. All of it. Even if it kills us? Even then. Elena turned to look at him, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of shared purpose. They were two broken people in a broken place, trying to fix something that had been wrong for too long. Then let's get to work, she said. We've got a kidnapping to plan. They spent the next 2 days preparing, transforming the abandoned saloon into something between a fortress and a trap. Victor reinforced the main entrance with salvaged timber, created firing positions at the second-floor windows, and mapped every escape route through the surrounding buildings. Elena inventoried their supplies. Enough food and water for maybe a week if they were careful, ammunition for the rifle in Victor's Colt, and the precious satchel of evidence that represented their only real weapon against the Dalton Empire. On the morning of the 3rd day, Victor rode out alone, leaving Elena hidden in redemption with strict instructions to stay out of sight. The plan was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Clara Dalton made weekly trips to Red Hollow to visit the dressmaker and attend social functions at the church. She traveled with minimal escort, usually just her personal attendant and a single ranch hand, because nobody in their right mind would dare touch Silas Dalton's daughter. Victor was betting everything on the fact that he wasn't in his right mind anymore. He positioned himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main road between the Dalton Ranch and Red Hollow, the rifle resting across his knees. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks around him, and Victor waited with the patience learned from years of hunting both animals and men. Waiting was a skill most people never mastered, the ability to quiet your mind and let time pass without fidgeting or second-guessing. Around midday, he spotted the dust cloud that signaled approaching riders. Through the rifle's sight, he identified Clara's buggy, a fine black carriage that looked absurdly elegant against the rough frontier landscape. The girl herself was visible in the passenger seat, her blonde hair pinned up beneath a fashionable hat, her dress the kind of impractical finery that spoke of wealth and privilege. Beside her sat an older woman, probably her attendant. A single ranch hand rode ahead on horseback, looking bored and overconfident. Victor took a deep breath, centered himself, and fired. The shot kicked up dust 10 feet in front of the lead horse, causing the animal to rear and whinny in panic. The buggy jerked to a stop, the attendant screaming, Clara gripping the seat with white knuckles. The ranch hand wheeled his horse around, reaching for his gun, scanning the rocks for the shooter. Victor's second shot took the hat clean off the ranch hand's head without touching a hair on the man's scalp. The message was clear. I can kill you if I want to, but I'm choosing not to. The ranch hand froze, his hand hovering near his weapon but not drawing it. Climb down slow, Victor called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Keep your hands where I can see them. The man complied, moving with exaggerated care. Clara's attendant continued screaming until Clara herself slapped her sharply across the face, silencing her with shocking efficiency. Who are you? Clara called out, her voice steady despite the circumstances. What do you want? Victor emerged from the rocks, rifle trained on the ranch hand. Up close, he could see that Clara Dalton was younger than he'd expected, maybe 19 or 20, with her father's sharp eyes and her mother's delicate features. But there was steel in her expression, the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly challenged. Your father and I need to have a conversation, Victor said. You're going to help arrange that. Recognition flickered across Clara's face. You're the one from town, the drifter who stood up to Marcus. That's right. You're making a terrible mistake. My father will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this. Probably. But right now, I need you to step down from that buggy and come with me. Nobody needs to get hurt. The ranch hand tensed, preparing to make a move. Victor swung the rifle toward him without looking away from Clara. Don't. I've killed men for better reasons than protecting a kidnapping. Don't make me add you to the list. The man's nerve broke. He raised his hands higher, defeat written across his face. Clara studied Victor for a long moment, then gathered her skirts and climbed down from the buggy with surprising grace. You realize this is suicide. There's no scenario where you survive what comes next. Your concern is touching. Now start walking, north toward the canyon. What about them? Clara gestured toward her attendant and the ranch hand. They'll ride back to your father and deliver a message. Tell Silas that his daughter is safe and will remain so as long as he's willing to negotiate. Tell him to come to Redemption, alone, if he wants to see her alive again. The attendant finally found her voice. Mr. Dalton will kill you slowly for this. He'll make you beg for death. I've been begging for death for years, Victor said quietly. Now, get moving before I change my mind about letting you live. He watched them ride away at a gallop, dust rising in their wake, then turned to Clara. She stood with her arms crossed, looking more annoyed than frightened. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Some desperate criminal, a madman, not someone who looks like he's thought this through and regrets it already. Victor almost smiled. The girl was observant. Start walking. It's a long hike to Redemption, and those shoes won't make it easier. They walked in silence for the first hour, Victor keeping a careful distance behind Clara, the rifle ready but not pointed directly at her. The girl picked her way through the rough terrain with determination, gathering her skirts to climb over rocks, not complaining despite the obvious discomfort. You're doing this for Elena Ward, Clara said finally. For revenge. Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference? Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Justice is about making things right. Clara laughed, a sharp sound without humor. You sound like my mother. She used to say things like that before she died. Victor glanced at her, caught off guard. I saw her portrait in your father's house. She looked like a strong woman. She was. Stronger than my father in some ways. She's the one who insisted I get an education, who made sure I could read and think for myself. Father wanted to raise me like some delicate flower, but Mother refused to let that happen. Clara paused, navigating around a large boulder. She died of fever 5 years ago. Since then, Father's gotten harder, colder. My brothers say he was always ruthless, but at least Mother could temper it sometimes. And now? Now there's no one to tell him no. No one he'll listen to anyway. They reached Redemption as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Elena appeared in the doorway of the saloon, her hand on a pistol Victor had given her, her expression wary as she watched Clara approach. This is her? Elena asked. Silas Dalton's daughter? Clara Dalton, the girl said, introducing herself with surprising poise given the circumstances. And you must be the widow my family murdered. I'd say it's a pleasure, but that would be a lie. Elena's hand tightened on the pistol. Your brothers lynched my husband in the street like a dog. I know, I heard about it. Clara met her gaze steadily. For what it's worth, I told Marcus it was wrong, told my father he should have handled it differently. They didn't listen. And that's supposed to absolve you? No, nothing absolves me. I've benefited from my family's crimes my whole life. Every comfort I've enjoyed, every privilege I've taken for granted, it's all built on blood and theft. I know that. Clara's voice carried something unexpected, shame maybe, or the weight of complicity. But knowing and being able to change it are two different things. Victor guided Clara inside the saloon, gesturing toward a chair. Sit. We need to discuss how this is going to work. Clara sat, looking around the abandoned room with interest rather than fear. Redemption. I remember this place. We used to ride out here when I was a child. Father would point to it as an example of what happens when people don't plan properly, don't think long term. He said the men who built Redemption were fools chasing silver dreams. Maybe they were just people trying to build something, Elena said coldly. Not everyone has the luxury of stealing what they want. You're right, and I don't expect you to believe this, but I'm not like my father or my brothers. I never wanted the ranch, never wanted the power that comes with the Dalton name. Clara looked between Victor and Elena. So what now? You send a ransom demand? Threaten to kill me if father doesn't confess his crimes? Victor pulled up a chair and sat facing her. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to hurt you. All we want is leverage to force a negotiation. Negotiation for what? Justice for Caleb Ward and everyone else your family has wronged. We have evidence, years of documented crimes. All we need is time to get that evidence to people who can act on it. Clara was quiet for a moment. You have evidence? Real evidence, not just accusations? Victor showed her the satchel, let her see some of the documents inside. He watched her face as she read, saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw her hands begin to shake. I knew it was bad, Clara whispered. But this is systematic. This is an empire built on lies and murder. She looked up at Victor. How did you get all this? People who were tired of being silent, people who needed someone brave enough to stand up first before they could find their own courage. Clara set down the papers carefully as if they might burn her. If this gets out, it will destroy my family. Not just my father and brothers, but everyone connected to the Dalton name, including me. Good, Elena said flatly. But Clara shook her head. You don't understand. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm saying that when this comes out, and it should come out, there will be consequences beyond just legal ones. The ranch employs over 100 men. They have families who depend on those wages. What happens to them when the Dalton Empire collapses? It was a question Victor hadn't fully considered, and it spoke to a complexity he'd been trying to avoid. Bringing down the Daltons would create a power vacuum, economic chaos, potentially more suffering than it prevented. That's not our problem, Elena said. Your family made their choices. They have to face the consequences. Even if innocent people suffer for it? Innocent people are already suffering. My husband is dead. How many others have died or lost everything because of your family's greed? Clara nodded slowly. You're right, and I'm not trying to excuse what they've done. I'm just saying that justice is more complicated than it looks from a distance. She turned to Victor. What exactly do you want from my father? What would satisfy you? Public confession, Victor said. Admission of what was done to Caleb Ward and restitution to the families they've wronged. And most importantly, genuine change in how they operate. No more intimidation. No more violence. Rule through law instead of fear. You're asking my father to surrender everything that makes him powerful. I'm asking him to choose between his daughter and his empire. Clara smiled sadly. You assume he'll choose me. You don't know Silas Dalton very well. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Victor had been counting on parental love to override ambition, but Clara's certainty suggested he might have miscalculated. Then we'll adapt, Victor said, more confidently than he felt. Your father's coming. We'll see what he's willing to negotiate. They didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Victor moved to the second-floor window and counted at least 30 riders spreading out around Redemption, surrounding the ghost town in a loose perimeter. Torches flickered in the darkness, turning the abandoned buildings into a landscape of dancing shadows. Silas Dalton rode at the center of the formation, flanked by his 3 sons. Even from a distance, Victor could see the old man's rage in the set of his shoulders, the rigid way he held himself in the saddle. They stopped just outside rifle range. Marcus Dalton rode forward alone, his hands visible and empty, and called out into the night. "Hale, we're here to talk. Send out my sister, and we can end this peacefully." Victor stepped into the doorway where he could be seen but still had cover. "Your father was supposed to come alone." "Change of plans. You kidnapped a Dalton. You don't get to dictate terms." "Then we have nothing to discuss." "Wait." Marcus held up a hand. "What do you want? Money? Land? Name your price and let's be done with this." Victor felt Clara appear beside him, felt her sharp intake of breath as she saw the army her family had brought. "They're not here to negotiate," she said quietly. "They're here to kill you and rescue me by force." "I know." Elena joined them, the pistol in her hand, her face pale but determined. "So what do we do?" Victor had been preparing for this moment, had known it would come, but seeing it play out still sent ice through his veins. He called out to Marcus, "I want justice for Caleb Ward. I want your father to confess publicly what was done to him and everyone else your family has destroyed." Marcus laughed. "You want us to commit suicide, not going to happen. Then your sister stays with us. And every day she stays, I'll send more evidence of your family's crimes to the territorial governor, to federal marshals, to newspapers back east. By the time I'm done, the Dalton name will be synonymous with everything that's wrong with this territory." "You're bluffing. You'll never get that evidence out of this canyon alive." Victor pulled out one of the documents and held it up. "This is a sworn statement from your own foreman, Frank Hollister, detailing 12 murders ordered by your father over the past 5 years. I've already made 3 copies. One's hidden in Red Hollow, one's on its way to Denver, and one's staying with me. You kill us, and it all comes out anyway." It was a complete bluff. Victor hadn't had time to make copies or send anything anywhere, but it was delivered with enough confidence that he saw Marcus hesitate. Silas Dalton rode forward then, pushing past his son. The old man's face was illuminated by torchlight, and Victor saw not fear or uncertainty, but cold calculation. "Let me speak to my daughter," Silas called out. "Let me verify she's unharmed." Victor nodded to Clara. She stepped forward, into the light. "Father," she said, her voice carrying across the distance. "I'm fine. They haven't hurt me." "Have they touched you, threatened you in any way?" "No, they've been surprisingly civilized about the whole kidnapping." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Clara, I need you to be honest with me. Do you believe these people will actually let you go? Or are they planning to use you as a shield while they escape?" Clara glanced back at Victor and Elena, then returned her gaze to her father. "I think they're desperate people trying to do something right in a world that's given them every reason to give up. And I think they're willing to die for it." That doesn't answer my question. "Yes, it does. They'll let me go if you give them what they want. But you won't give them what they want, will you, Father? Because you never back down. You never compromise. You never choose people over power." The accusation in her voice carried across the canyon like a slap. Silas Dalton's face hardened. "You've been poisoned by their lies. I've been reading evidence of your crimes. Documented, detailed evidence that proves everything they're saying is true. You had Caleb Ward murdered. You've stolen land, corrupted officials, destroyed anyone who stood in your way. And the worst part is, you don't even seem to think it's wrong. I built an empire from nothing," Silas's voice rose. "I fought Comanche and outlaws and the frontier itself to create something lasting, something that would survive beyond my lifetime. Yes, I made hard choices. Yes, people got hurt. That's the cost of civilization, Clara. Someone has to be strong enough to impose order on chaos." "By becoming the chaos?" Clara's voice broke. "By making people fear you more than they feared the Comanche? That's not civilization, Father. That's tyranny." Silas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and cold. "You have 1 hour to release my daughter. After that, my men will storm that building and kill everyone inside. Clara, if you're still in there when that happens, I'm truly sorry, but I can't let these people destroy everything I've built." Clara's face went white. "You'd really let them kill me? Your own daughter?" I'd rather see you dead than watch everything I've created burn down because I showed weakness. Silas turned his horse around. 1 hour, Hale. Then we're coming in. They rode back to join the larger group, leaving Clara standing in the doorway, shaking with shock and disbelief. He's bluffing, Elena said. He has to be bluffing. But Victor had seen the look in Silas Dalton's eyes, had heard the finality in his voice. He's not bluffing. To him, the Empire is more important than any individual, even his own daughter. Showing mercy now would encourage others to challenge him. He can't afford that. Clara turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. I told you he wouldn't choose me. He never has. Then we fight, Elena said, gripping her pistol tighter. We make them pay for every inch of this building. Victor looked around the abandoned saloon, calculating odds that got worse the longer he thought about them. 30 men against 3 people, one of whom had minimal shooting experience. They might take a few attackers down, but the outcome was inevitable, unless they changed the game entirely. There's another option, Victor said slowly. We use the time we have left to get evidence out of here. Clara, you know this territory better than we do. Is there a way out of this canyon besides the main road? Clara wiped her eyes, thinking. There's an old mining trail on the eastern ridge. It's dangerous, barely passable even on foot, but it leads over the mountains toward the territorial road. If you could reach it before Father's men realize you're gone, how long would it take? On horseback, moving fast? Maybe 45 minutes. But it's dark, the trail is treacherous, and one wrong step could send you over a cliff. Victor turned to Elena. You take the evidence, follow that trail, get to the territorial road and find help. Federal marshals, the governor, anyone who'll listen. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. This whole thing only matters if the evidence survives. If we both die here, the Daltons win. But if you get out, if you expose what they've done, then maybe Caleb's death means something. And what about you? You're just going to stay here and die? I'm going to buy you time. Keep the Daltons focused on this building while you escape. Clara stepped between them. There's a better way. I'll go with her. Father's men won't shoot at me, which means we can use the main road. You create a distraction here, we ride out during the confusion, and by the time Father realizes what's happened, we'll be too far ahead to catch. Victor stared at her. Why would you help us? This is your family we're destroying. My family destroyed itself years ago. I've just been pretending not to notice. Clara's voice steadied. My mother would have stood up to Father, would have stopped this before it got so bad. I owe it to her memory to do what she couldn't. Elena looked at Victor, 1,000 questions in her eyes. He nodded slowly. All right, but we need to move fast. Silas gave us an hour, but he might attack sooner just to catch us off guard. They spent the next 20 minutes preparing. Clara changed into riding clothes from Elena's supplies, practical gear that would serve better than her fancy dress. Elena gathered the evidence satchel, double-checking that every crucial document was secured. Victor loaded extra ammunition, positioned himself at a second-floor window with a clear view of the Dalton forces, and tried not to think about how this was likely his last stand. When you hear the first shot, he told Elena and Clara, you ride hard and don't look back. Stick to shadows until you clear the canyon, then push the horses as fast as they'll go. Elena crossed to him, her eyes fierce. You better survive this, Victor Hale. You better find a way out. I'll do my best. That's not good enough. Promise me you'll try. Promise me you won't just throw your life away because you think you deserve to die. Victor looked at this woman who'd reignited something in him he'd thought long dead, the belief that fighting for justice mattered, that standing up for what was right was worth any cost. I promise, he said, and meant it. Clara was already mounted, holding the reins of Elena's horse. Elena climbed up, adjusting the satchel across her shoulders. Thank you, Clara said to Victor, for giving me a chance to be better than my family. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're safe. He watched them position themselves near the back entrance of the saloon, then returned to his window. The Dalton forces were still arranged in their loose perimeter, torches burning, rifles ready. They looked confident, patient, like hunters who knew their prey had no escape. Victor took careful aim at the torch closest to Marcus Dalton and squeezed the trigger. The shot shattered the night, the torch exploding in a shower of sparks. Men shouted, dove for cover, returned fire at the saloon. Victor moved to a different window, fired again, keeping their attention focused on the building. Behind him, he heard hoofbeats as Elena and Clara rode out the back, using the chaos to cover their escape. Return fire shattered windows, punched holes in the weathered walls. Victor kept moving, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted effectively, making each shot count. He hit another torch, then a man's shoulder, then a horse that reared and threw its rider. "He's alone," someone shouted. "The women are escaping." Riders peeled off to give chase, but Victor had given Elena and Clara enough of a head start that catching them would be difficult. He fired at the pursuit, forcing them to take cover, buying every additional second he could. Then Thomas Dalton did something Victor didn't expect. The young man grabbed a torch and charged directly at the saloon, screaming in rage, apparently deciding that a frontal assault was better than patience. Victor shot the torch from his hand, but Thomas kept coming, crashing through the front entrance with his gun drawn. Victor descended the stairs fast, his Colt ready. Thomas was wild-eyed, bleeding from a cut on his forehead where burning debris had struck him, beyond reason or tactics. "You took my sister!" Thomas screamed. "You made us look weak!" He fired wildly, bullets tearing through the room. Victor returned fire, his shot catching Thomas in the shoulder and spinning him around. The young man went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Victor moved to secure him, but the front entrance exploded inward as more Dalton men rushed the building. Victor retreated up the stairs, firing as he went, knowing he was running out of options and time. He barricaded himself in the second-floor room, pushed furniture against the door, took position at the window. Below, he could see Silas Dalton directing his forces, organizing a coordinated assault on the building. This was it. The last stand he'd been half expecting since the day he rode into Red Hollow. Victor checked his ammunition, 4 rounds left in the Colt, maybe a dozen in the rifle, and prepared to make them count. But then something changed in the valley below. New torches appeared, coming from the direction of Red Hollow. At first, Victor thought it was reinforcements for the Daltons, but as they got closer, he recognized faces. Samuel Wong riding at the front, his grandson Danny beside him, Mrs. Patterson on an old mare, looking terrified but determined. Garrett and Carlos and half a dozen other ranch hands who'd apparently decided they were tired of working for tyrants. And behind them dozens more townspeople, all carrying whatever weapons they could find, rifles, shotguns, even farming implements. They didn't attack. They just formed a line between the Dalton forces and the saloon, a human barrier that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Silas!" Samuel's voice rang out clear and strong. "This ends now. Either you back down, or you'll have to go through all of us. And if you do that, if you massacre half the people of Red Hollow, there won't be an empire left to rule." Silas Dalton stared at the crowd, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "You'd choose these fugitives over the Dalton family? We've given you jobs, protection, stability. You've given us fear," Mrs. Patterson called out. "You've made us complicit in murder and theft. You've turned us into cowards, but no more. We're done bowing to you." Victor watched from the window, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. The people of Red Hollow, the ones he'd thought too frightened to act, were making their stand. Maybe seeing Elena and Victor refuse to back down had given them courage. Maybe they'd just finally reached their breaking point. Either way, they were here, and they were changing everything. Marcus Dalton spurred his horse forward, positioning himself between his father and the townspeople. His hand rested on his gun, but even he seemed to recognize that drawing it would ignite a bloodbath that nobody could control. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "All of you. When this is over, when sanity returns, you'll remember that you sided against the family that built this valley. And there will be consequences." "Then let there be consequences," Garrett called out from the line of townspeople. "I've spent 8 years taking your father's money and pretending not to see what was being done in his name. I'm tired of pretending. We all are." Silas Dalton sat rigid in his saddle, his face carved from stone. Victor could see the calculations running behind those cold eyes, weighing options, measuring risks. The old man had built his empire on understanding when to push and when to hold, and he was facing a situation he'd never anticipated, his own people turning against him. "Where's my daughter?" Silas finally asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Safe," Victor called down from the second-floor window. "Riding toward the territorial road with Elena Ward and enough evidence to bury your family's legacy in the darkest hole you can imagine." "You let her go with that woman?" After everything we've done, you trust my own daughter to betray me? I trust her to do what's right. Something she learned from her mother, not from you. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. His hands tightened on the reins, his jaw clenching so hard Victor could see the muscles jumping beneath the weathered skin. Thomas Dalton groaned from somewhere inside the saloon, his wounded shoulder reminding everyone that blood had already been spilled tonight. The sound seemed to break through Silas's paralysis. "James," Silas said quietly, "go get your brother. Bring him out here where we can see to that wound." James Dalton hesitated, looking between his father and the armed townspeople, then slowly rode toward the saloon. Victor kept his rifle trained on him but didn't fire. James dismounted, walked into the building with his hands visible, and emerged a few minutes later supporting Thomas, who was pale and bleeding but alive. "The bullet went through clean," James called out. "He'll live, but he needs a doctor." "Then take him back to the ranch," Silas said. "You too, Marcus. This doesn't concern you anymore." Marcus stared at his father. "You're just going to let them win? Let them destroy everything we've built?" "I'm choosing my battles, something you've never learned to do." Silas's voice was flat, empty of the fire that usually drove him. "Your brother needs medical attention. Take him home. I'll handle this." "Father, that's an order." Marcus and James exchanged glances, then carefully loaded Thomas onto a horse. They rode away slowly, Marcus looking back over his shoulder with an expression that promised this wasn't finished, that there would be reckonings to come. But for now, they were gone, and Silas Dalton sat alone facing the people he'd ruled through fear for 15 years. "What happens now?" Samuel Wong asked, his rifle still held ready. "You planning to ride us all down once you get reinforcements? What would be the point?" Silas's laugh was bitter, defeated. "You think I haven't noticed what's been happening? The way people look at me now, the whispers that stop when I enter a room. I'm not blind, Mr. Wong. I know my time is ending. I've known it since my wife died and took the last bit of humanity I had left with her." He dismounted slowly, his bad leg making the movement awkward and painful. Up close, Victor could see how much the old man had aged. The deep lines in his face, the gray exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under invisible weight. "I built this empire because I was terrified," Silas said, and the raw honesty in his voice silenced everyone. "Terrified of going back to poverty, of being weak, of losing control. My father died broke and broken, destroyed by men stronger than him. I swore I'd never let that happen to me. I'd be the strong one, the one in control, the one nobody could touch." "So you became what you feared," Victor said quietly. "Yes, I became the monster I was running from." Silas looked up at the saloon where Victor stood. Caleb Ward was a good man. I knew it even as I ordered his death. He reminded me of who I might have been if I'd made different choices. That's why I killed him, not because he was stealing cattle, but because looking at him made me see what I'd lost. Mrs. Patterson moved forward in the line of townspeople. "That doesn't absolve you, Silas. Confession without restitution is just self-pity." "I know, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just tired of pretending to be something I'm not." Silas walked closer to the saloon, ignoring the rifles that tracked his movement. "Hale, you still up there?" "I'm here." "My daughter. You really believe she'll testify against me? Turn over evidence that will destroy her own family?" "I believe she's tired of carrying the weight of your sins, and I believe she wants to be the person her mother raised her to be, not the person you tried to make her." Silas nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. "Clara was always more like her mother than like me. Strong in ways I never understood. I thought I was protecting her by making her part of the empire, teaching her to be hard, but all I did was make her hate what we'd become." He turned to face the assembled townspeople, his voice carrying across the canyon. "I'm not going to fight this anymore. I'm not going to chase down my daughter or try to stop the evidence from reaching the authorities. Whatever comes, I'll face it. But I'm asking, not demanding, asking that you let me do one thing first. Let me go to Red Hollow and confess publicly what I've done. Let me give these people the truth before the law takes me." "Why?" Victor asked suspiciously. "What game are you playing?" "No game. Just an old man trying to find some dignity before the end. If I'm going to be remembered as a tyrant, I'd rather be remembered as one who owned his crimes instead of running from them. Samuel Wong stepped forward. You expect us to trust you after everything? No, I expect you to watch me very carefully and shoot me if I try anything. But I'm asking for the chance to do this right, to stand in front of the people I've terrorized and tell them the truth. Let them see that even monsters can face justice. The townspeople murmured among themselves, uncertain. Victor climbed down from the saloon, his rifle ready, and approached Silas. Up close, he could see the genuine exhaustion in the old man's eyes, the weight of decades of violence and guilt finally breaking through the armor of ruthlessness. If you're lying, Victor said quietly, if this is some trick to buy time or set a trap, I will personally make sure you suffer for every crime you've committed. I know, and if I were you, I wouldn't trust me either, but I'm asking anyway, because it's all I have left. Silas met his gaze steadily. My empire is falling. My sons will abandon me when the truth comes out. My daughter already has. All I want is to stand in front of the people I've hurt and tell them I know what I did. That's all. Victor studied him for a long moment, then made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed. All right. But you're right in the middle of us. One wrong move, and you're dead. They formed a strange procession back to Red Hollow. Silas Dalton surrounded by the very people he'd spent years oppressing, all of them armed and watching for treachery, moving through the darkness like a funeral march for an empire built on blood. The ride took 2 hours, and dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow. Word had spread somehow, probably from the ranch hands who'd chosen to join the townspeople, and the entire town was awake and gathered in the main street. Victor saw Sheriff Porter standing on the steps of his office, his face gray with fear and confusion. The Dalton brothers hadn't returned yet, probably still tending to Thomas's wound, which meant this moment belonged entirely to Silas and the truth he'd promised to tell. Silas dismounted in front of the hanging tree, the rope still swaying gently in the morning breeze, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the thick branch where Caleb Ward had died, then turned to face the assembled crowd. Most of you know me, Silas began, his voice rough but carrying. Know my name, know my reputation, know the fear that name inspires. What you might not know is that I earned that fear through systematic cruelty, through murder, through destroying anyone who stood in my way. The crowd was silent, shocked by the admission. People who'd lived under Dalton rule for years were hearing their oppressor confess, and none of them knew how to process it. Caleb Ward was innocent, Silas continued. He didn't steal cattle. He didn't break any law. He just refused to give up land that was rightfully his, and I had him killed for it because I wanted that land, and I was used to taking whatever I wanted. His voice cracked. My sons put the rope around his neck, and I let them do it. I could have stopped it, could have found another way. But I chose violence because it was easier than negotiation. Elena Ward appeared at the edge of the crowd, having ridden back when she heard what was happening. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes burning with rage and grief, and something that might have been vindication. And Caleb wasn't the first, Silas said, his confession gaining momentum like a rock slide. There were others before him, ranchers who refused to sell, farmers who disputed water rights, anyone who challenged the Dalton Empire. Some I had killed outright. Others I destroyed through legal manipulation, through corrupt officials, through systematically taking everything they'd built until they had no choice but to leave or die. He gestured to Sheriff Porter, who looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. I paid good men to become corrupt, turned lawmen into accomplices, made people who wanted to do right become part of the evil they were supposed to prevent. That's my legacy, not the cattle empire, not the prosperity I claimed to bring, but the way I corrupted everything I touched. Clara Dalton emerged from the crowd then, still in her riding clothes, her face pale but resolute. She walked to her father and stood beside him, not touching him but present in a way that spoke of complicated love and necessary betrayal. I'm sorry, Father, she said quietly, but this needed to happen. I know, little one, and you were right to make it happen. Silas looked at her with something like pride mixed with profound sadness. You're stronger than I ever was. You're willing to sacrifice everything for what's right, while I sacrificed everything for power. Elena pushed through the crowd, walking directly up to Silas Dalton. The old man faced her without flinching, accepting whatever judgment she was about to deliver.
"You killed my husband," Elena said, her voice shaking. "You took away my future, my family, everything I'd built."
"Yes. You did it because you could, because you'd done it before and gotten away with it and saw no reason to stop." "Yes. And now you stand here confessing because what? You've suddenly found a conscience? You've decided that honesty is the best policy?" Silas shook his head. "I'm confessing because I've been caught. Because my daughter and people braver than me made it impossible to keep lying. Don't mistake this for redemption, Mrs. Ward. This is just an old man who's run out of places to hide." Elena stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she did something that shocked everyone, including Victor. She slapped Silas Dalton across the face, hard enough that his head snapped to the side. "That's for Caleb," she said, "and for every other person you destroyed. Confession doesn't bring them back. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't make you anything other than what you are, a murderer who happened to be rich enough to make it legal." "I know," Silas said, touching his reddening cheek. "I know what I am." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Marcus and James Dalton rode into town with a dozen armed men, their expressions dark with fury. They pulled up short when they saw their father standing before the crowd, saw Clara beside him, saw the townspeople armed and ready.
"What have you done?" Marcus demanded, his voice tight with rage. "Father, what in hell have you done?" "I've told the truth. Something I should have done years ago. You've destroyed us. You've handed them everything they need to take down the entire family." "The family was already destroyed, Marcus. It died the same day your mother did. I just kept it walking around like a corpse, pretending it was still alive." James dismounted, his hand on his gun. "We can still fix this. Take back control. These people are nobody. We can make them forget what they heard." "By killing them all?" Silas asked. "There are over 100 people here, James. You going to murder an entire town to protect a lie? If that's what it takes." "No." Silas's voice carried absolute authority, the command of a man who'd spent decades being obeyed. "It's over. The empire ends today. You can accept that and start figuring out how to build something better from the ruins, or you can run. But you will not harm these people." Marcus's face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You're choosing them over your own blood? Over everything we've built together?" "I'm choosing truth over lies, justice over tyranny. It's about 40 years too late, but I'm making the choice anyway." For a moment, Victor thought Marcus might actually draw his weapon, might try to kill his own father rather than accept defeat. But Clara stepped between them, her small frame somehow commanding in its determination. "It's over, Marcus," she said. "You can either accept that with dignity or prove that you're even worse than father. Choose." The brothers stared at her, then at the armed townspeople, then at their father's defeated posture. Finally, Marcus's shoulders slumped. "You're dead to me," he said to Silas. "All of you. The Dalton name dies today." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, James following after a moment's hesitation, and their men trailing behind them in confused disarray. Samuel Wong stepped forward. "We sent a rider to the territorial capital 3 days ago, when this all started. Federal marshals are already on their way, should be here by tomorrow evening." Silas nodded. "Then I'll wait for them. Sheriff Porter, I'm placing myself under arrest for the murder of Caleb Ward, an accessory to numerous other crimes I'll detail in full testimony." Porter looked like he might be sick. "Mr. Dalton, Do your job, Sheriff. For once in your miserable career, actually uphold the law instead of perverting it." Porter fumbled with his shackles, his hands shaking as he placed them on Silas Dalton's wrists. The sight of the most powerful man in the valley standing in chains sent a wave of shock through the assembled crowd, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. Clara touched her father's arm gently. "I'll make sure you have a lawyer, a real one, not someone you've bought." "Thank you. And Clara, your mother would be proud of you. I wish I'd told you that more when she was alive." "She knew, and she always hoped you'd find your way back to the man she fell in love with. That man died a long time ago, but maybe at the end I can at least stop being the monster he became." They led Silas Dalton to the jail he'd used to imprison his enemies, locked him in the same cell where Victor and Elena had been held, and the symbolic weight of it was almost crushing. The empire had fallen in a single morning,
brought down not by violence, but by truth, by the accumulated courage of people who'd finally decided they were tired of being afraid. Victor found Elena standing by the hanging tree, her hand on the rough bark, tears streaming down her face. "It doesn't feel how I thought it would," she said quietly. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I just feel empty." "Justice doesn't fill the hole that grief leaves," Victor said. "It just stops the bleeding so you can start to heal." "Will I? Heal?" "Eventually, maybe not completely, but enough to keep living, enough to build something new from what's left." Elena turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "What about you? You've spent years running from yourself, running from what happened to your family. Has any of this helped?" Victor thought about Sarah and Emily, about the guilt he'd carried for so long, about the violence he'd done in their names, and the emptiness it had left behind. "I don't know yet, but for the first time in years, I feel like maybe I can stop running. Like maybe standing for something is better than just surviving." "So you'll stay? In Red Hollow?" "For a while at least. Someone needs to make sure the Dalton brothers don't come back looking for revenge. And someone needs to help this town figure out what comes next, now that the empire that controlled it is gone." Elena nodded, then did something unexpected. She took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "Thank you, Victor, for standing with me when no one else would, for helping me finish what Caleb started. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for." They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, Red Hollow beginning the slow, difficult process of rebuilding itself into something better than what it had been. The federal marshals arrived the next day as promised, 3 hard-eyed men who'd seen enough frontier justice to be skeptical of everything. But Elena presented them with the evidence Samuel had collected, Clara testified about her family's crimes, and Silas himself provided detailed confession after detailed confession, naming names and detailing atrocities that made even the experienced lawmen pale. The trial took 3 weeks, held in a makeshift court in Red Hollow's church. People came from across the territory to watch the fall of the Dalton Empire, to see the powerful brought low by the truth they'd tried so hard to bury. Silas pleaded guilty to everything, refusing to let his lawyer mount any defense, accepting his fate with the same grim determination he'd once used to build his empire. The judge sentenced him to hang, the same death he'd inflicted on Caleb Ward and others, but Silas died in his cell before the sentence could be carried out, his heart finally giving out under the weight of age and guilt. Some people said it was justice, others called it mercy. Victor thought it was just the ending of a long, tragic story about a man who'd lost himself in pursuit of power. Clara Dalton inherited the ranch, but immediately began the process of breaking it up, selling land back to the families her father had stolen it from, providing restitution where possible, transforming what had been an empire of fear into something closer to a community. She became one of the most outspoken advocates for land reform in the territory, using her family's infamy as a platform to push for change. Marcus and James disappeared into the deeper territories, starting over under different names, their inheritance reduced to whatever they could carry in their saddlebags. Rumors occasionally surfaced about their activities. Some claimed they'd become outlaws. Others said they'd gone straight, but they never returned to Red Hollow, and the valley was better for their absence. Mrs. Patterson expanded her boarding house, turning it into a proper hotel that became the social center of a town learning to live without fear. Samuel Wong started a newspaper documenting the changes sweeping through the valley and ensuring that the truth of what had happened would be preserved for future generations. Danny Wong became the youngest deputy in the territory, carrying on his grandfather's commitment to justice. Sheriff Porter resigned in disgrace, unable to face the people he'd betrayed. The town elected Garrett as their new sheriff, and he proved surprisingly effective at maintaining order through respect rather than intimidation. And Elena Ward took Caleb's ranch back, rebuilt it from the ruins the Daltons had left, and made it thrive in ways her husband would have been proud of. She never remarried, preferring to honor Caleb's memory by living the life they'd planned together, making the land productive and treating everyone fairly. Victor stayed, as he'd promised. He took a small cabin on the outskirts of town and worked various jobs: ranch hand, deputy, even occasional protection for people traveling through the territory. He became part of Red Hollow's community, accepted despite his past, valued for the man he was becoming rather than condemned for what he'd been. On Sunday mornings, he often found himself at Caleb Ward's grave, placing fresh flowers alongside the ones Elena brought. They talked sometimes about the past, about the future, about the strange paths life took, and the unexpected ways that justice could manifest. 6 months after the trial, on a cool autumn evening, Victor found Elena sitting on the porch of her rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley that had cost them both so much. "You ever think about leaving?" Elena asked. "Starting over somewhere where nobody knows what happened here?" "Sometimes. But then I remember that running never actually solved anything, just postponed the reckoning." Victor sat beside her, comfortable in the silence between them. "Besides, this place needs people who remember. Who'll make sure what happened to Caleb and all the others isn't forgotten or whitewashed into something it wasn't?" "Samuel's newspaper does that." "Newspapers are one thing. Living witnesses are another." Victor paused. "And maybe I've finally found a place worth staying in, worth being part of." Elena smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded expression Victor had seen from her since Caleb's death. "He would have liked you, Caleb. He believed that people could change, that violence didn't have to be the answer to everything. You proved him right. I didn't change that much, just finally stopped running from who I was and started trying to be something better." "Isn't that the definition of change?" They sat together as darkness fell across the valley, two survivors of different tragedies who'd found their way to something like peace. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth and possibility, and Red Hollow settled into its new identity, a town no longer ruled by fear, still scarred by its past, but finally free to imagine a different future. Victor thought about Sarah and Emily, allowed himself to remember them not with crushing guilt, but with the bittersweet ache of love that endures beyond loss. He thought about all the violence he'd done and the blood on his hands that no amount of justice could wash away. And he thought about the choice he'd made in that boarding house room when Elena had asked for help, the choice to stop running, to stand for something, to believe that maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about refusing to let it define the future. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For everything, for standing with me, for helping me see this through. Thank you for reminding me what courage looks like, what it means to refuse to bend even when bending would be easier." Elena reached over and took his hand, and they sat there holding on to each other like two people who'd survived a storm and finally reached shore. Above them, stars emerged one by one, mapping the darkness with points of light, infinite and enduring. Red Hollow slept peacefully that night, dreaming different dreams than it had under Dalton rule. And in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, Victor Hale finally rested without nightmares, without guilt, without the weight of running from himself. The frontier would always be dangerous, always be unforgiving, but it could also be redeemed, could be transformed by people brave enough to stand against injustice and stubborn enough to believe that truth mattered more than power. The hanging tree still stood at the end of Main Street, but someone had finally cut down the rope, letting it fall to the dust where it belonged. In its place, young shoots were beginning to grow from the old cottonwood's roots, new life emerging from soil that had seen too much death, reaching toward the light with patient determination. It was a small thing, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but Victor noticed and he smiled, recognizing it for what it was. A promise that even in the harshest places, even after the worst atrocities, renewal was possible if people were willing to do the hard work of building something better from the ruins. He mounted his gray mare and rode north out of Red Hollow as the sun crested the eastern mountains, not running this time, but simply moving forward, carrying with him the lessons learned and the scars earned and the quiet certainty that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years. Not redemption, exactly. Not absolution for the things he'd done or the people he couldn't save. Just the simple, profound knowledge that standing up mattered, that fighting for justice was worth the cost, and that even broken people could choose to be better than their worst moments. The valley opened before him, vast and beautiful and filled with possibility, and Victor Hale rode into it without looking back, ready at last to face whatever came next.